My name is Catriona Blackburn. I am from the University of Manchester. I'm also autistic, I'm ADHD, late diagnosed, and I'm 38. So I've been through various stages of hormonal fluctuations in my life. And I've also got 3 degrees, which means that I can lecture you, and it's socially acceptable for you to listen to me. So that's quite helpful. My degrees are in anthropology. I have an undergrad in anthropology BSc, I have a master's in film and practice, and I have a master's with social anthropological research. I forget, there's too many. And I'm currently doing my PhD. If you don't know what a PhD is, it's not a course, it's more like writing a book. I have to write 80,000 words, and I have to do 2 years of research. But really, what qualifies me to speak on this topic is my lived experience. Not only as somebody who was late diagnosed autistic and ADHD, but also the parent of somebody that was, in my opinion, late diagnosed autistic and ADHD. So I actually was only diagnosed at the age of 36. I thought that my deep, almost curious observation of social behaviour in humans was called anthropology, which is why I did a lot of degrees in it. But it turns out I'm actually just autistic, but also ADHD. And even the ADHD, someone else had to point out to me, because I thought I was a bit greedy having both things, right? I thought, I can't take it all. So I stuck with the autism because that made a lot of sense for me. It was deeply empowering for me, and I didn't need to go anywhere with it. And when I realised I was ADHD, it had got to the point where it had disabled me so badly that I physically could not read or write, which is unhelpful when you are doing a 4-year PhD. And so I did go the private route to get diagnosed with both, and then diagnosed again with ADHD so I could access the resources of stimulant medication, which has not changed my life, but has subtly given me the chemicals I need to be able to work. So we see a lot of crossover with autism and ADHD. Actually, 50 to 70% of individuals that are autistic also meet the criteria for ADHD. That doesn't mean that they're ADHD. It means that they meet the criteria for ADHD. That's because a lot of the actual criteria for diagnostic is the experience and behaviour that is overlapped. So it's not necessarily true that people who are autistic and show the diagnostic for criteria ADHD are actually both things. But people who are autistic and ADHD have shown to have more social unresponsiveness and difficulties than people who are simply autistic and or ADHD. So there is a difference between the lived experience of people who are both autistic and ADHD than there is with people who are simply ADHD. And there isn't enough research on this. When you look at research on behaviour, we're looking at research of people that have been observed by someone else. So a lot of what is seen due to the criteria being so closed is autistic people having to process a lot of information and therefore having delayed motivation and delayed responses, which looks like ADHD. And what we're seeing is ADHD people who have a lower dopamine and other neurotransmitters level within their brain, not being able to have neurons communicate with each other in their brain, and it looks the same. But that's not actually the same. And so much more research needs to be done. What you do see, though, is biomarkers on the brain in imaging. So we see differences between ADHD autistic people and neurotypical people, and we see differences between autistic people and ADHD people. But we also see similarities in those differences and why certain things would help. So some studies show, for instance, that ADHD children have a lower uptake of oxytocin in their amygdala. the area of the brain that is associated with emotional regulation, and oxytocin is that love hormone. So maybe you had a clingy baby that turned out to be autistic or ADHD. And the ADHD and autistic brains have a weaker overall structure of the prefrontal cortex in the immaturity compared to peers their age. That doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that brain. It means the part of the prefrontal cortex, I'm not a neurologist, so forgive me if I mess this bit up, compared to others, is weaker and immature at that expected age. And parts of the brain, autistic children and ADHD children, that's to do with emotional regulation. There's more fluctuating activity, particularly in autistic people. See much more fluctuating activity. That doesn't mean that, so the amygdala and the brainstem, there are the areas of the brain where we produce emotion, that we have emotional regulation. It means that upon stimulation, there is more activity in those areas of the brain, but there's also lower activities at other times. So it's an undulating experience. It is not heightened at all times, but it goes up and down more dramatically than we would see in our NT peers. So in short, we don't know why the correlation exists, but even now, as early as 2022, we're seeing much more progressive research being done, usually with the voice of an autistic person, because there's a lot of us in academia. So ADHD, I want to talk about. We have this familiar acronym of ADHD. ADHD has been around for 100 years. But unfortunately, due to that, it has become synonymous with this idea of naughty little boys in the playground, this idea of morality. And this is the reason I'm still talking about brains. So ADHD includes controlling impulsive behavior, poor concentration, poor emotional regulation, and short-term memory loss. And that's all due to a biological liability in the brain of chronic low neurotransmitters. I couldn't get the actual, do we have less production of them? Do we hold on to them less? I don't actually know that. I couldn't find the answer, but the neurotransmitter level is lower than expected always. And those neurotransmitters are actually a chemical that allows our neurons in the brain to communicate with each other. So if you are ADHD, you might recognize that feeling of something just on the periphery and that constant anxiety of just, I've forgotten something. There's something else there that I need to do. So ADHD, we know, can be seen in the functions and physicality of the brain as autism as well. This is a neurotype. It's a difference in the brain. It is not a moral failing. It is not about how many notebooks you have, or how many alarms you make, or if you just really need to get organized. And stimulant medication helps ADHD, we know that. It also helps people who are autistic due to that area in the brain that is more stimulated emotionally or by outside stimuli. That up and down and fluctuating emotional regulation can be helped by dopamine. So if somebody is misdiagnosed as both autistic and ADHD or just ADHD when they're actually autistic, stimulant medication might actually help them. But it's still really important to understand our actual diagnosis for our personal well-being and the way that we care for ourselves and allow other people to care for us. One of those reasons that we get so overwhelmed by life is all the extra processing you're doing. And today I really want to validate the people in this room because there isn't many studies on this, but I know as people start talking openly about their neurodivergence and are proud of the thing that has empowered them to look back at their life and see that there's nothing wrong with them, there's nothing that they're deficient in, that the world around them is a difficult place to be when you have a brain like ours. So Golan and Perez Velazquez, thank you, first time, in 2014 found that autistic children at rest processed 42% more information than their neurotypical peers at rest, not with any mortgage to pay, not with having to go on the school run with 4 kids, not with any other potential stressor on yourself. At baseline, we walk into a room, the bright lights, I am aware of them. I'm aware of each spotlight in this room. I'm aware of the white walls and how it bounces back the light onto me. I'm aware of the reverb and the background noise. All of these things I'm processing at baseline, and I'm not at rest. So I don't know what percentage I can even imagine. But I know any extra thing is going to make all that feeling of overwhelm so much worse for me, including my hormonal fluctuation. One of the amazing developments in contemporary the community is the double empathy theory by Damien Milton in 2012. Only 12 years ago, the double empathy theory being the revolutionary idea that autistic people maybe don't have communication issues and lack of empathy, but they just communicate with other autistic people well. And the same goes with ADHD. And non-autistic people communicate well together, but actually 2 neurotypes together probably find it a little bit stressful, a little bit difficult, maybe needs to be a little bit of work done. But maybe let's not put all the emphasis on autistic people to do that work or be trained to do that work. But the concept of the double empathy theory recognizes the values and diversity in communication styles and perspectives from autistic people and that diversity itself. But that changed the attitude dramatically, changed the concept of learning that about yourself being an empowering thought, not something that categorized you as different and deficient or problematic. But I am talking about menstruation and menopause here, but for anybody, there's a lot of this research that talks about women and it is studied on women. But obviously when I'm talking about these things, I'm talking about people who have been born biologically female, people that have dealt with any hormonal fluctuations due to perhaps taking estrogen as well, anybody that has a womb, and anybody that's dealt with any of those estrogen and progesterone, really. And the reason for that is that hormonal fluctuations affect dopamine directly. Dopamine, one of our neurotransmitters, that affect, as I've said, both autistic and ADHD people hugely. And they can affect your mood, but also your executive functioning skills, your ability to actually get up and do things, your mental health in general. Now, if you're suddenly not able to clean your teeth in the morning, you don't feel great about yourself. You can't clean up after your pets. You can't remember to feed your kid on time. You're not going to feel great about yourself either. So all of those things not only affect your actual skills and the ability to function, but your mental health in general. And the menopause in the UK starts at around 45 to 55 on average. And perimenopause, which is the start of those symptoms, starts 4 years earlier. So this explosion in diagnoses that we keep hearing about kind of started with, the changes in our parenting, the way in which we changed in our parenting, the way in which we stopped this authoritarian parenting, started maybe getting a little bit curious, maybe validating people's emotions, being kinder a little bit, maybe not physically smacking our children. And with that curiosity came this understanding that individuals have needs that perhaps we want to learn more about. And maybe some of those kids ended up, it was autism they were struggling with, or it was ADHD, that was the thing that meant that their needs were different to other children their own age. And then a few years later, maybe we get a bit more curious and realize those things really apply to us too. Those mothers are hitting the age of menopause at the same time that this big explosion is happening. One of the biggest demographics for people seeking adult ADHD and adult autism diagnosis are parents of children with that same diagnosis. So what's the link between hormones and diagnosis and hormones and ADHD and autism? Well, simply that processing. We're processing all of these extra things, and then suddenly we're dealing with these huge hormonal fluctuations. And all of these things become more difficult. Like I say, I've got 3 degrees. They were difficult degrees. And then I hit year 1 of my PhD and I couldn't read anything. I couldn't concentrate on more than 2 paragraphs. I couldn't write more than a paragraph. I wasn't doing any work. One of the reasons for that was because I was disabled by something called endometriosis, which is a gynecological condition where cells that are similar to the inside of the endometrium, which is the layer of the uterus, start to grow in different areas of the body, but they also produce their own estrogen, and it causes hormonal fluctuations in the body. So not only was I dealing with the pain of that, the fatigue of that, I was also dealing with the hormonal fluctuations. Thankfully, I was able to have surgery last summer. And it's amazing to me that a year ago I was bedbound. This time last year I was bedbound. The research on late diagnosis of women shows that now diagnosis is seen as generally an empowering thing that's tinged with sadness due to previous experiences which were either emotionally painful or traumatic. And participants identified numerous reasons for not having been diagnosed as a child, included gender and racial stereotypes, successful masking behaviour, and a lack of professional knowledge on ADHD, and perceived overemphasis in diagnosing other mental health conditions in women, and that just women are invisible. That was the word they used. I felt invisible because women are invisible. Dr. Tony Lloyd, who's the chief executive of the AuDHD Foundation, says his own figures suggest that 400% increase since 2020 in adults seeking ADHD assessment. And he says also that dismissing ADHD as a cultural construct and undeserving drain on the finite NHS resources only adds to the enduring stigma and stereotyping of those with ADHD. Even as early as 2021, the average age for girls to be diagnosed was 17 compared to boys who were diagnosed at 8. So self-diagnosis, I want to say, is so valid, because if you can learn about the chemical implications and the hormonal implications on your day-to-day feelings of mental health, on your day-to-day ability to do tasks, then you can be kinder to yourself and you can care for yourself in a different way. So, as I say, lower estrogen and progesterone means lower dopamine. So on a usual and healthy cycle, the luteal phase, or the phase the week before the period actually starts, where your body is starting to shed the lining of the womb, there is a significant drop in progesterone and estrogen, which means there is a significant drop in dopamine. Usually, we call this PMS. So neurotypical people feel this too. It affects everybody. But for people who are autistic or ADHD, they might find it's much more severe than that. There's something called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is similar to PMD in that it's more prevalent in the luteal phase. And what happens is they don't just get a little bit irritable, but we might feel as extreme depression, as suicidal ideation, as extreme anxiety, irritability, and anger that we could possibly contemplate. And we just think it's normal. So one study on PMDD shows that it affects 5 to 8% of the population, and another showed that it affects 3% of the non-autistic population compared to 21% for autistic people. Researchers also discovered that compared to 11% of that population of non-autistic, non-ADHD people, women who are autistic and with a learning difficulty, such as ADHD, 92% have PMDD. There's things you can do about that. You can visit your doctor about that. You can try hormonal contraception. Just having this cycle app on your phone can help you self-validate, help you ask others for help, reduce your processing in those weeks. So if higher hormonal swings are linked to increased PMDD in people with autism, one can anticipate that menopausal symptoms will also be more severe. We know that in women with women with ADHD, depression and anxiety is generally more prevalent than in men with ADHD. And that depression and anxiety comes on just after puberty. And then just after your 20s, there's another hormonal fluctuation. You're more likely to have depression in pregnancy. You're more likely to have depression and anxiety postnatally. So all of these modes of hormonal fluctuation directly affect women who have any type of neurodivergency. So the other major thing to understand about this is addiction. And addiction goes hand in hand with ADHD, and addiction has a similar stigma to ADHD. On the 20th of March, I'll be 3 years sober from alcohol. Thank you. That's because addiction is simply dopamine chasing. So if you know about yourself, you know about these hormone fluctuations, you know when they're coming, you know about the amount of processing you have to do, what does self-care then look like? It looks like I'm going home and I'm turning the big light off, putting some nice lamps on. I'm making sure that I don't put too much on myself because I know long term that is going to be disabling for me. I don't allow myself to be totally overwhelmed on my luteal phase week. I say, I'll see how I feel. I'll say, I need this from you. I do that. I'll wear headphones in the supermarket and ignore everyone. I won't answer Facebook messages after 9 p.m. at night on my luteal phase because I need some time of my own. I'll let the washing up pile up a little bit. I'll forgive myself for angry outbursts. I'll explain to my children that I might be seeming irritable. I'll model these amazing boundaries that I'm going to find for myself, for my kids too. And I will find things that stimulate dopamine. When I realize that it's affecting me, I'll stim. I'll go and move my body. I'll go for a walk. I'll find things that actually affect my dopamine, listening to music, all of these different things. Because things that do affect dopamine are things like having a glass of wine in the evening. That can build up for us. Having that awareness that we're susceptible to not only these hormonal changes and emotional overwhelm due to our diagnosis or not diagnosis is so important for the mental health and well-being of ourselves and our family. And I think that's the end of what I have to say, because for me, logic really, really helps me a lot. So if I have the ability to care for myself, to look after myself, that's real self-care. You know, self-care isn't bubble baths and candles. Self-care is saying to somebody, could you please give me some quiet time just for 10 minutes? Because I can feel that I'm really overwhelmed this week. And that's all to do with unmasking as well, which Katie Charles is going to talk about later on. Thank you so much.